The city tasted of ash. Not the clean ash of wood fire, but the thick, oily residue of brown coal burned in 10,000 stoves, in the power stations that hummed beyond the wall, in the factories where men like Thomas Weber spent their days feeding machines that fed the state. It settled on everything in East Berlin in the winter of 1978, on the windowsills crusted with ice, on the wool coats hanging in cramped hallways, on the tongues of children who walked to school with their breath crystallizing in the air. Lukas Weber knew this taste before he could name it, knew it as intimately as he knew the smell of boiled potatoes and the sound of his mother's footsteps crossing the kitchen floor at dawn. The apartment occupied 4 rooms on the 3rd floor of a concrete block on Schönhauser Allee in the district of Prenzlauer Berg, where buildings stood shoulder to shoulder like prisoners in a lineup. The walls were the color of old teeth, yellowed by decades of coal smoke and poor ventilation. The ceilings pressed down with a weight that seemed psychological as much as architectural. In the main room, a brown sofa sagged in the middle, its cushions compressed by years of bodies sitting in the same positions, night after night, listening to the radio that was always on, always murmuring the approved version of reality into the stale air. The kitchen held a table scarred by knife marks and cigarette burns, 4 mismatched chairs, and a coal stove that became the center of life each winter, the only source of heat in rooms that never quite warmed. Lukas was 9 years old. He shared a bedroom with his younger sister, Greta, who was 6 and coughed through the nights with a wetness in her lungs that their mother treated with honey and worry. Their beds were narrow, the mattresses thin, the blankets never quite heavy enough. Between their beds stood a small table where Greta kept a wooden doll with painted eyes, and Lukas kept his schoolbooks and a collection of bottle caps he pretended had value. The window looked out onto the courtyard where washing lines crisscrossed the space like the rigging of a landlocked ship, where women hung laundry that froze stiff in the winter air, where the few scraggly trees stood bare and black against the perpetual gray sky. Thomas Weber worked at the VEB electrocoal factory in Lichtenberg, manufacturing carbon brushes for electric motors. He left the apartment each morning at 5:30, when the streets were still dark and empty, when the city held its breath between night and day. He returned after 7 in the evening, his hands black with graphite dust that never quite washed away, his shoulders bent with a weariness that had nothing to do with physical labor and everything to do with the grinding repetition of days that led nowhere. He was 34, but looked older, his face lined, his hair already graying at the temples, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of men who had stopped believing in futures. Renata Weber taught music at the Karl Marx Oberschule, drilling children in folk songs and patriotic anthems, correcting their posture at the piano with a ruler that she wielded with mechanical precision. She was thin in a way that suggested not delicacy, but deprivation. Her wrists like birds' bones, her collarbone sharp beneath her blouses. She moved through the apartment with an efficiency born of necessity, making meals from the ingredients available: potatoes, cabbage, the occasional bit of pork fat, bread that was dense and gray. She spoke little, and when she did speak, her voice was quiet, measured, as if she were constantly calculating the cost of each word before releasing it into the world. The routine of their lives was as predictable as the changing of the guard at the Soviet War Memorial. Breakfast at 6, bread with margarine, ersatz coffee that tasted of burnt grain. School for Lukas and Greta, work for Thomas and Renati. Lunch from the school cafeteria, where the food was hot but tasteless, where children ate quickly and without complaint because complaint was not permitted. Not about food, not about anything. Dinner at 8, the family gathered around the kitchen table, eating in a silence broken only by the scrape of forks on plates and the hiss of the coal stove. Homework by lamplight, the electricity rationed by habit even when it was available. Bed by 9, the apartment settling into darkness, the sounds of other families bleeding through the thin walls. Arguments, coughing, the tinny music of radios tuned to the state stations that never stopped broadcasting. But beneath this routine, Invisible as the carbon monoxide that leaked from poorly sealed stoves, something else was happening. Lukas felt it first in his parents' silences, which became different somehow, heavier, charged with meaning he could not decode. He noticed his father burning papers in the kitchen stove, watching them curl and blacken with an intensity that seemed excessive. He noticed his mother packing and repacking a canvas bag that appeared in the hall closet, then vanished, then reappeared. He noticed conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered rooms, his parents' voices dropping to whispers that were not quite whispers, more like the hiss of air escaping from a punctured tire. They began to take walks in the evening, his parents, leaving him to watch Greta, telling him they needed fresh air, though the air outside was no fresher than the air inside, only colder. They would return after an hour, their faces flushed with cold, their eyes meeting in glances that excluded him and Greta, that spoke a language he had not been taught. His father started coming home with small items that appeared without explanation. A compass, a thermos, a pair of thick socks that were clearly Western-made, the quality too good for anything produced in the Democratic Republic. His mother withdrew further into herself, became even more silent, her hands shaking slightly when she poured tea, when she buttoned Greta's coat, when she thought no one was watching. Lukas understood that something was wrong, but wrong was a complicated concept in a place where the ordinary rules of morality had been inverted, where loyalty to the state was virtue and longing for freedom was treason, where the walls had ears and the streets had eyes and trust was a luxury no one could afford. He was 9 years old, and he had been raised in this world, had absorbed its logic through his skin, through the constant low-level fear that was as much a part of the environment as the coal dust and the cold. He knew not to ask questions. He knew that curiosity was dangerous. He knew that the best way to survive was to notice nothing, to see nothing, to know nothing. 2 floors below the Weber apartment lived the Müller family. Oberleutnant Dieter Müller was an officer in the Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, though this fact was never stated directly, only implied through the quality of his apartment, the newness of his car, the way other residents of the building would nod deferentially when he passed in the stairwell. He was a man of medium height and medium build, with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of a bureaucrat rather than a policeman, which in many ways he was. A bureaucrat of fear, an accountant of betrayal, a clerk in the vast filing system of surveillance that the state had built to monitor its own citizens. Müller's wife was rarely seen, a pale woman who kept to their apartment, who shopped at the special stores available to Stasi families, where Western goods appeared like miracles, real coffee, oranges, chocolate. Their son Jonas was 11, tall for his age with his father's thin face and his mother's pale eyes. He attended the Karl Marx Oberschule like Lukas, though they were in different grades, different worlds in the rigid hierarchy of the school system. Jonas was a member of the Thalmann Pioneers, wore his blue neckerchief with pride, attended the meetings and rallies with an enthusiasm that seemed genuine, or at least well-practiced. Lukas and Jonas had become something like friends through the forced proximity of the apartment building, through the courtyard where children played in the few hours between school and darkness, through the stairwell encounters that happened daily in a place where privacy was a fiction and everyone's life bled into everyone else's. Jonas had a football, a real one, leather and properly inflated, not the makeshift balls the other children kicked around. He had colored pencils from the West, a collection of model trains, books with glossy pages and full-color illustrations. He shared these things with a generosity that seemed natural, but that Lukas would later understand was calculated, the way his father shared information, the way the state shared propaganda, strategically, with purpose, always extracting more value than it gave. They played in the courtyard most afternoons when weather permitted, Jonas teaching Lukas football techniques, Lukas teaching Jonas the constellation patterns he had learned from a book borrowed from the school library. They talked about school, about teachers, about the petty dramas of childhood that seemed monumental in the moment. Jonas spoke about his father with a mixture of pride and fear that Lukas recognized because it mirrored his own feelings toward Thomas, though the reasons were different. Jonas's father was powerful, connected, secure in the machinery of the state. Lukas's father was a factory worker with graphite under his fingernails and defeat in his eyes. In early December, as the first serious snow began to fall, coating the city in a whiteness that would turn gray and filthy within hours, Oberleutnant Muller began appearing more frequently in the Weber's orbit. He would be in the stairwell when Thomas came home from work, would nod pleasantly and make small talk about the weather, about the news, about nothing. He would encounter Renate at the corner store, would help her carry her shopping bags, would ask after the children with the kind of interest that seemed neighborly, but that had an edge to it, a sharpness barely concealed. Thomas and Renate would come home from these encounters pale and silent, would sit at the kitchen table not speaking, the air between them thick with unspoken terror. Lukas watched these interactions without understanding their significance. To him, Muller was just Jonas's father, a man who was friendlier than most adults, who would sometimes slip him a piece of Western chocolate, who asked questions about school and hobbies with what seemed like genuine interest. The man smiled often, a thin smile that never quite reached his eyes, and he had a habit of adjusting his glasses when he was listening, as if focusing his vision helped him hear better. His voice was soft, pleasant, the voice of a teacher or a doctor, not the voice Lukas associated with danger. It was in the third week of December, 11 days before Christmas, that the betrayal happened, though Lukas would not understand it as betrayal for many years, would not understand that the words that left his mouth that afternoon in Jonas's apartment would set in motion the machinery that would destroy his family as surely as if he had pushed a button, pulled a trigger, signed a document. Jonas had invited him up after school. His mother was out, his father at work. The apartment empty in a way that was rare and therefore exciting to two boys who lived in spaces where privacy was almost non-existent. They played with Jonas's model trains, setting up elaborate tracks across the living room floor, crashing the cars together with the violence that children find entertaining. They ate bread with plum jam and drank weak tea that Jonas made without adult supervision. They sat by the window watching snow fall over the courtyard, watching other children, younger, less privileged, build a snowman that was already melting, already collapsing under its own weight. Jonas asked him what he wanted for Christmas. Lukas shrugged, said he didn't know, that there wasn't much available, that his parents didn't have much money. Jonas nodded sympathetically, said his own father was gone a lot, that sometimes he wished they could go somewhere else, somewhere with more sun, more color, less gray. Lukas agreed reflexively, said everyone wanted that, said his own parents talked about it sometimes, about other places, about leaving. The word hung in the air like the particles of coal dust that never quite settled. Leaving. Jonas went very still, his pale eyes fixed on Lukas with a new intensity, and Lukas felt a flutter of unease, a sense that he had said something wrong though he could not identify what. Jonas asked casually, too casually, what his parents said about leaving, where they wanted to go, when they talked about this. And Lukas, eager to please, eager to maintain the friendship that gave him access to the football and the colored pencils and the model trains, began to talk. He talked about whispered conversations he had overheard, about his mother packing a bag, about his father bringing home strange items, about walks in the evening that seemed purposeless but that he now understood, explaining it to Jonas, had purpose. He talked about the compass and the thermos and the Western socks. He talked about his parents studying maps when they thought he was asleep, about their tense faces, about the way they had stopped making plans beyond next week, beyond tomorrow, as if the future had contracted to an immediate, urgent point. Jonas listened with the focus of someone much older, asking questions that seemed innocent but that led Lukas deeper into confession, that extracted details he had not known he possessed. When did these walks happen? What route did they take? Did his parents have friends who had left? Who lived in the West? Did they have money saved? Papers prepared? Contacts on the other side? Lukas answered as much as he could, filling in gaps with speculation that became certainty in the telling, constructing a narrative of his parents' plans that was part observation, part imagination, all devastating. When he finally stopped talking, exhausted by the confession he had not known he was making, Jonas was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, the same thin smile his father wore, and said it was good that Lukas's parents wanted a better life, that everyone deserved that maybe they would succeed. He said nothing else about it, changed the subject to school, to football, to the Christmas concert that was being planned at the Oberschule. But something had shifted in the air between them. Some invisible border had been crossed, and Lukas felt it in his stomach, a cold weight that had nothing to do with the weather or the weak tea or the gray light filtering through the windows. He went home an hour later, climbed the 2 flights of stairs to his apartment with legs that felt heavy, with a sense of dread he could not name. His parents were home, his father reading the newspaper with the intensity of someone looking for messages between the lines, his mother preparing dinner with mechanical movements. Greta was drawing at the kitchen table, her cough a wet rhythm in the background. Everything was normal. Everything was the same. But Lukas felt different, felt as if he had broken something precious without meaning to, without even knowing what it was until the pieces were scattered at his feet. That night he lay in bed unable to sleep, listening to Greta wheeze in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the building settling around him, footsteps above, a door closing below, voices arguing somewhere distant. He thought about what he had told Jonas, tried to convince himself it was nothing, that Jonas was his friend, that friends kept secrets. But he had been raised in this world, had absorbed its lessons even when he tried not to, and some part of him knew that secrets were currency here, that information was power, that loyalty to the state superseded loyalty to anything or anyone else. The next days passed with a terrible normalcy, school, homework, meals eaten in silence. His parents continued their evening walks, continued their whispered conversations, continued preparing for something that Lukas now understood with sickening clarity was an attempt to cross the border, to escape to the West, to commit the ultimate crime against the state that owned them. He wanted to tell them what he had said to Jonas, wanted to warn them, but how could he explain it without revealing how much he had noticed, how much he had understood? And part of him still hoped he was wrong, that Jonas would say nothing, that his words would evaporate into the air like breath in winter, leaving no trace. But Oberleutnant Müller knew. This became clear in small ways that accumulated into certainty. He appeared more frequently in the stairwell, always at times when Thomas was coming or going, always smiling that thin smile, always asking questions that seemed casual, but that Lukas now recognized as interrogation. He stopped the Webers in the street, suggested they all have coffee sometime, insisted with a friendliness that was itself a form of threat. He sent Jonas up to play with Lukas, and Jonas would ask more questions, always circling back to the same subjects, travel, plans, the future. And Lukas, terrified now, would say nothing, would claim ignorance. But his silence was itself an answer, a confirmation of what had already been reported. The surveillance became visible if you knew how to look, and Lukas had learned. A car parked on the street that never seemed to move, its windows dark, its engine occasionally running. A man in a gray coat who appeared at the corner when Renati left for work, who followed at a distance that was meant to be noticed. The phone in their apartment developing a strange echo, a delay between speaking and hearing, the telltale sign of a tap. His father noticed these things too. Lukas could tell from the way his face went pale, from the way his hands shook when he lifted his coffee cup, from the way he stopped bringing items home, stopped taking evening walks, stopped preparing. But it was too late to stop. The machinery had been set in motion, the gears were turning, and the state did not forgive intention even when action had been aborted. The state punished thought, punished desire, punished the mere consideration of betrayal. And Thomas and Renati had done more than consider. They had planned, had prepared, had been days or perhaps hours away from attempting what thousands had died trying to accomplish. The departure was planned for December 23rd, a Friday night when the border guards would be distracted by holiday rotations, when the darkness came early and stayed late, when the cold would keep people indoors, and the snow would cover tracks. Lukas knew the date because he had overheard it whispered between his parents in the kitchen after they thought the children were asleep, had heard it and committed it to memory with the sick certainty that something terrible was coming, that the knowledge itself was a weight he would carry forever. On the morning of the 23rd, Thomas did not go to work. He called in sick, claiming a fever, and stayed home sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes with the mechanical rhythm of someone trying to keep panic at bay. Renati took Lukas and Greta to school as usual, kissed them both goodbye with an intensity that frightened Lukas, that made him want to cling to her coat and refuse to let go. But he was 9 years old, and 9-year-old boys did not cry, did not cling, so he walked into the school building and did not look back, though he felt her eyes on him, felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing. The school day passed in a blur. He could not concentrate on lessons, could not eat his lunch, could not respond when teachers called on him. Jonas sat across the classroom and never looked at him, kept his eyes forward with the discipline of someone who had been trained, who knew his role, who was already becoming his father. At 3 o'clock, when school let out, Lukas walked home slowly through streets where Christmas decorations hung limp in the gray air, where shop windows displayed their meager offerings with propaganda posters promising abundance that never materialized. The apartment was different when he returned. Cleaner somehow, emptier, as if his parents had already begun erasing themselves from the space. The canvas bag sat by the door, packed and ready. His father wore his good coat, the one reserved for party meetings and funerals. His mother had applied lipstick, a rare thing, the color too bright against her pale skin. Greta was confused, asking questions that were not answered, sensing the strangeness but unable to decode it. They ate an early dinner, soup that no one finished, bread that stuck in throats too tight with fear to swallow properly. At 7 o'clock, as the building settled into evening routines, as televisions switched on and families gathered around radios, as the ordinary machinery of life continued around them, the Weber family prepared to leave. Not permanently, not obviously. They would simply go out for a walk, a family outing. Nothing unusual about a family taking a walk even in December, even in the evening. They would walk to the S-Bahn station, would take the train to Köpenick, would meet a contact who would guide them through the woods to a place where the wall was lower, where guards were rumored to be less vigilant, where possibility existed in the narrowest of margins. They dressed in layers, not so many as to be obvious, but enough to protect against the cold of a December night spent outdoors, spent hiding, spent running. Thomas carried the canvas bag. Renati held Greta's hand. Lukas walked beside his father, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might be visible through his coat, might give them away before they even left the building. They descended the stairs in silence, each footfall echoing in the stairwell, each breath visible in the cold air. They reached the ground floor. Thomas pushed open the door that led to the street, and the world exploded into lights and voices and hands grabbing, pulling, separating them with the efficiency of a machine that had performed this operation countless times before. There were 6 men, maybe 7. It was impossible to count in the chaos, in the glare of flashlights that turned the dark street into a stage, into a theater of capture. They wore the dark coats of the Stasi, the leather jackets that signified authority, that gave them permission to do whatever they deemed necessary. They shouted commands in voices trained to be obeyed, to bypass thought and trigger compliance. They grabbed Thomas first, slammed him against the wall with force enough that his glasses flew off, skittering across the icy pavement. They grabbed Renati, who did not struggle, who went limp like a rag doll, whose only resistance was the hand that would not release Greta, that had to be pried open finger by finger. Lukas stood frozen, unable to process what was happening, unable to connect this violence to the careful plans his parents had made, to the whispered conversations, to the packed bag that now lay on the ground with its contents spilling out. Clothes, documents, Western marks that glinted in the flashlight beams like evidence of a crime already committed. Someone grabbed his arm, not roughly but firmly, and pulled him aside, away from his parents, away from Greta who was screaming now, a high thin sound that cut through the night like a siren. Oberleutnant Muller emerged from one of the cars parked at the curb, cars that Lukas now understood had been waiting, had known, had been part of the choreography of this arrest. He walked over to where Thomas was being held against the wall, his face bleeding from where it had struck the concrete, his eyes wild with the kind of terror that animals show before slaughter. Muller adjusted his glasses, that familiar gesture, and spoke in his soft, pleasant voice that carried clearly in the cold air. "You were going for a walk," he said, and it was not a question. A family walk on a Friday evening, how wholesome, how innocent. Except for the money, of course, except for the documents, except for the contact you were meeting in Köpenick, except for the treason. The word hung in the air, final as a verdict, heavy as stone. Thomas said nothing, could say nothing, blood running down his chin, his body held immobile by two men who were trained for this, who had done this before, who would do it again. Renati was crying silently, tears running down her face without sound, her body shaking with sobs that had no voice. Greta had stopped screaming and was now making small whimpering sounds like a wounded animal. Muller turned and looked directly at Lukas, who stood 10 feet away, held by a man whose hands were gentle but whose grip was absolute. The Oberleutnant smiled, that thin smile, and nodded once, a gesture that encompassed everything: acknowledgement, approval, gratitude. Then he turned back to Thomas and continued speaking in that same soft voice that made everything worse, that made the violence of the arrest seem reasonable, bureaucratic, necessary. "Your son is very talkative," he said, "very helpful. A good socialist in the making. You should be proud." And Lukas understood then what he had done. Understood it with a clarity that was physical, that hit him like a fist to the stomach, that made his legs buckle so that the man holding him had to support his weight to keep him upright. He had destroyed his family. He had betrayed his parents. He had sentenced them to prison, to interrogation, to the destruction of their lives not through malice but through innocence, through the trust he had placed in friendship, through words spoken in a moment of connection that had been weaponized, transformed into evidence, into guilt, into treason. His father's eyes found his across the distance, across the chaos of the arrest, and in them Lukas saw not anger but something worse, resignation, understanding, a terrible kind of forgiveness that was more damning than any accusation could have been. His mother would not look at him, kept her face turned away, and that rejection was its own kind of verdict. They were taken away in separate cars, his father in one, his mother in another, Greta screaming for Mama in a third. Lukas was placed in a car with Muller, who sat beside him in the back seat and said nothing. Just sat there adjusting his glasses, looking out the window at the streets of Ost-Berlin sliding past, dark and empty and cold. They drove to the district Stasi headquarters, a building Lukas had passed countless times without really seeing, one of those structures that was everywhere and nowhere, that people's eyes slid past because to look directly at it was to acknowledge its existence, to acknowledge the machinery of surveillance and control that sustained the state. Inside, the building was fluorescent bright, the lights harsh and unforgiving, revealing every crack in the walls, every stain on the floor. It smelled of disinfectant and cigarettes and fear, that particular odor of fear that was different from other fears. That was the smell of people who knew they were powerless, who understood that the rules they had thought protected them were fiction, that the state owned them completely, body and mind and future. Lukas was led to a room with a table and chairs, was told to sit, was left alone for what might have been an hour or might have been 4. Time becoming elastic, meaningless, in the fluorescent glare. When Muller finally returned, he brought weak tea in a chipped cup and a plate of cookies that were soft with age. He sat across from Lukas and smiled that thin smile and began to speak in his soft voice about responsibility, about duty, about the important role that children played in protecting the state from enemies, internal and external. He did not accuse Lukas of anything. He thanked him instead, told him he had done the right thing, that his parents had been making a terrible mistake that would have destroyed the family, that by speaking he had actually saved them from themselves. Lukas said nothing. He could not speak, could not look at Mueller, could only stare at the tea growing cold in the chipped cup, while the Oberleutnant's voice washed over him like water, like poison, like the logic of a system that transformed betrayal into virtue, that made victims complicit in their own destruction, that required everyone to participate in the machinery of control or be crushed by it. He was released after midnight, driven back to the apartment building by a man who said nothing, who walked him to the door, who watched him climb the stairs to an apartment that was now empty, that echoed with absence, that smelled of soup gone cold and lives interrupted. A neighbor woman, Frau Hoffmann from down the hall, was there waiting, had been told to watch him, to make sure he did not do anything foolish, though what foolish thing a 9-year-old boy could do in this situation was unclear. She made him more tea, told him to sleep, told him everything would be sorted out, lies delivered with the kindness of someone who knew they were lies, but could offer nothing else. He did not sleep. He lay in his narrow bed in the room he had shared with Greta, staring at the ceiling where cracks formed patterns he had memorized over years of sleepless nights, listening to the building settle around him, listening to life continuing in the apartments above and below, people sleeping and waking and eating and working, the ordinary machinery of existence grinding forward while his own life had stopped, had ended, had been destroyed by his own mouth, his own trust, his own childish inability to understand that in this world there were no friends, only informants, only tools the state used to maintain its grip on power. His parents were held for 72 hours, interrogated in shifts, their confessions extracted through the patient application of fear and exhaustion, and the constant reminder that their children were vulnerable, were dependent on the state's mercy, would suffer for their parents' crimes. Thomas was sentenced to 3 years in prison for attempted Republikflucht, for attempting to flee the Republic, though he would serve only 18 months before being released, diminished, broken, a shadow of the man he had been. Renati was sentenced to 2 years, served 14 months, came out silent and gray and old before her time. Greta was placed in a state home for the children of enemies of socialism, where she would be re-educated, where her memory of her parents would be systematically replaced with loyalty to the party, to the collective, to the state that was her true parent, her true family, her true home. Lukas would not see her again for 6 years, and when he finally did, she would not remember him, would not remember the apartment on Schönhauser Allee, would not remember anything before the home that had become her world. Lukas himself was sent to live with an aunt in Halle, a woman he barely knew, a party loyalist who treated him with cold efficiency, who made sure he was fed and clothed and educated but who never touched him, never spoke to him except in commands, who made clear through her silence that he was contaminated, that his parents' crime had infected him, that he was and would always be suspect. He attended school in Halle, joined the pioneers, learned to mouth the correct responses, to sing the correct songs, to perform loyalty with the desperate intensity of someone trying to prove their worth to a system that had already judged them irredeemable. He never spoke to Jonas Müller again, though he would sometimes see him in dreams, in nightmares, standing in that apartment holding the model trains, asking questions with his pale eyes that saw everything, that missed nothing, that had been trained from birth to observe and report and serve the machinery of the state without question or mercy. Jonas would grow up to join the Stasi like his father, would become another Oberleutnant, another bureaucrat of fear, would probably have children of his own who he would train in the same skills, the same loyalties, the same willingness to sacrifice everything and everyone to the system that fed them. The wall would stand for 11 more years after 1978. 11 more years of families torn apart, of lives destroyed by attempting to cross 43 kilometers of concrete and wire and mines and guards with orders to shoot. When it finally fell in 1989, Lukas would be 20 years old enough to cross into the West legally, old enough to stand in streets he had only imagined, to see buildings unscathed by war, to taste air that did not carry the weight of surveillance. But by then the damage was done, the wounds were carved too deep to heal, and he would carry forever the knowledge of what he had done, of how his innocence had been weaponized, of how the system had used him to destroy the people he loved most. He would learn that his father died in 1991, only 2 years after release, his body giving out after decades of factory work and prison, and the weight of betrayal by his own child. His mother lived longer, survived into the new century, but she never spoke his name again, never answered his letters, never acknowledged his existence. She had lost too much to forgive, had been broken too completely to rebuild, had learned too well that love was a liability, that trust was a weapon, that in a world built on surveillance and betrayal, the only safety was in feeling nothing, in caring for no one, in becoming as empty as the apartments they had lived in, as hollow as the promises of the state that had owned them. And Lukas would live with this knowledge, would carry it like a stone in his pocket, like a tumor growing slow and patient in his chest, like the taste of brown coal that never quite washed away. He would understand that he had been a child, that he could not have known, that the guilt belonged to the system that created the conditions where childhood friendship could become a tool of oppression. But understanding did not absolve, did not erase, did not change the fact that he had spoken words that destroyed lives, that his mouth had been the mechanism through which the state had reached into his family and torn it apart. The machinery of the surveillance state did not require monsters. It required only ordinary people making ordinary mistakes, only children who trusted, only parents who dared to dream of freedom, only neighbors who reported what they saw, only bureaucrats who filed papers and followed orders. It required participation, complicity, the slow erosion of humanity that came from living in a world where everyone watched everyone, where every word was potentially evidence, where love itself was dangerous because it created vulnerabilities the state could exploit. This was the lesson Lukas learned in 1978, in the cold winter of East Berlin, in an apartment on Schönhauser Allee that stood empty for years after his family was torn apart, stood as a monument to what had been lost, to the lives that had been possible before the words were spoken, before the betrayal was made, before the machinery began to turn. And the lesson would stay with him forever, would shape him into someone who could not trust, could not love, could not believe that connection was anything other than danger, that intimacy was anything other than a weapon waiting to be used. The wall came down, the state collapsed, the files were opened and people learned who had informed on them, learned that their friends had been spies, their lovers had been agents, their own family members had reported their conversations to the authorities. The machinery of surveillance was revealed in all its terrible completeness. Tens of thousands of informants, millions of files, a system so pervasive that no one had been safe, no relationship had been sacred, no thought had been private. But knowing changed nothing. The damage was done. The lives were destroyed. The children who had been used as tools of the state grew into adults who could not escape what they had done, what had been done to them, what they had lost. And Lukas Weber, who at 9 years old had told his friend Jonas about his parents' plans, who had betrayed his family through innocence and trust and the simple human need for connection, carried that knowledge into every day of his life, carried it like the taste of coal dust, carried it like the weight of gray skies, carried it like the silence that had filled the apartment after his family was taken away, carried it like the ghost of the boy he had been before he learned that in some worlds, in some systems, in some times and places, childhood itself was not protection, innocence was not defense, and love was the most dangerous thing of all.